Miss Marple and the Haunted Christmas. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, do you look forward to winter's calm, or do you prefer the warmth of summer? Share in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for new mysteries every day. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, Snow. Holly and Haunted Room. The burst pipe had been discovered at 7 on a bitterly cold December morning, and by 9, Gossington Hall was in a state of chaos that would have tried the patience of a saint. Mrs. Bantry, however, was not a saint, and her patience had been exhausted, somewhere around the moment when water began dripping through the ceiling of her favorite sitting room onto her newest aubusson. "Carpet, Miss Marple," she announced over the telephone, her voice carrying that particular mixture of exasperation and determination that comes to those who have dealt with recalcitrant plumbers before. "I'm coming to fetch you immediately. We're going to the Holly and Ivy Inn for Christmas, and I will not hear a word of protest. Miss Marple," sitting in her cottage in the village of St. Mary Mead with her knitting in her lap, smiled gently into the receiver. "My dear Dolly," she said, "I was not going to protest. A change of scene at Christmas can be quite refreshing, though I do hope the inn has proper heating. These old coaching houses can be dreadfully drafty." "Heating be damned," said Mrs. Bantry elegantly. "It has a ghost, Jane, an actual ghost. Room 7 is haunted by a widow who died there 50 years ago. The locals swear by it." There was a pause during which Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady click. "Click, click, how very interesting," she said at last, in the mild tone that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as signifying something quite other than mild interest. "I shall pack my warmest shawls." The Holly and Ivy Inn stood on the main road between St. Mary Mead and Market Basing, a handsome Victorian coaching house of red brick and white trim, its roof now thick with snow, and its windows glowing warmly in the gray December afternoon. Holly wreaths hung on every door, and ivy climbed the walls in elegant profusion. Mrs. Bantry's motor car pulled up before the entrance with a satisfying crunch of tires on gravel, and the two ladies were assisted out by a cheerful young man with dark hair and an engaging smile. "Welcome, welcome," he said, taking their cases. "I'm Neville Rowan. My stepmother runs the inn. You must be Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple. We've been expecting you. Dreadful business, burst pipes," he continued as he led them into a comfortable entrance hall, decorated with more holly and a magnificent Christmas tree. There was something in his manner, Miss Marple noted, that suggested anxiety beneath the charm. His eyes darted about rather too much, and his smile, though pleasant, did not quite reach those eyes. They were greeted in the hall by a tall, capable-looking woman of perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and a brisk, no-nonsense manner. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, I am Mrs. Rowan. I do hope you'll be comfortable with us. We're quite full for Christmas, you know. The inn has a certain reputation for ghosts." "I understand," said Mrs. Bantry with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Rowan's expression became, if possible, even more composed. "The house has its stories, as old houses do," she said carefully. "Room 7 is said to be rather particular, though I'm sure you'll find it all perfectly natural once you're settled. I should love room 7, said Mrs. Bantry immediately. "I'm afraid that room is already taken," said Mrs. Rowan. "Mr. Oswell Pierce from London has engaged it for the holiday. But we have 2 other very nice rooms just across the corridor." Miss Marple observed that Neville Rowan's jaw had tightened slightly at the mention of Mr. Pierce's name. "The room opposite room 7 will suit me." "Admirably," said Miss Marple. "I'm a very light sleeper, and I find it comforting to be near other guests." If Mrs. Rowan found this request peculiar, she gave no sign of it. They were shown upstairs by a young maid with red cheeks and nervous hands. The corridor was narrow and oak-paneled, with a faded turkey runner down the center. Miss Marple noted that her room 6 commanded an excellent view of room 7's door. When they had refreshed themselves and come down to tea in the parlor, they found several other guests already assembled. The parlor was a snug, low-ceilinged room with a crackling fire and chintz-covered chairs that had seen better days but remained comfortable. A woman of perhaps 45, dressed in flowing purple draperies and wearing an excessive amount of jewelry, occupied the best chair near the fire. She had dark, rather prominent eyes and an air of theatrical intensity. "Madame Zora," whispered Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple. "She gave a performance in market basing last week. Spiritualism and table rapping, you know." Beside the fire stood a thin, elegant gentleman with silver hair and a neat mustache, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He was observing Madame Zora with an expression of amused tolerance. Neville performed the introductions. The elegant gentleman was Mr. Basil Qualls, recently retired from the stage, where he had performed as an illusionist. Madame Zora acknowledged them with a languid wave of heavily ringed fingers. "I sense presences," she announced in a deep, resonant voice. "This house is thick with the other side. Room 7 particularly. I insisted upon sitting in the parlor below it last night. The vibrations were extraordinary." Mr. Qualls smiled quietly. "I'm sure they were," he said politely, "though I confess I slept quite soundly in room 4 and experienced nothing more supernatural than a slight draft under the door." At that moment, another man entered the parlor. He was perhaps 50, sleek and well-fed, with a London manner and expensive clothes that somehow looked wrong in the rustic setting. "Ah, Mr. Pierce," said Mrs. Rowan, her tone professionally welcoming but cool. "May I present Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple?" "They're staying over the holiday." Oswell Pierce bowed slightly. His eyes were small and clever, and they assessed the two ladies with the swift calculation of a man used to evaluating worth. "Delighted," he said. "Charming place, this. Full of character. I've been telling Mrs. Rowan that with the right investment, the Holly and Ivy could be quite the destination." Mrs. Rowan's expression remained polite, but Miss Marple noted a slight tightening around her mouth. "The inn has been in my late husband's family for 3 generations, she said quietly. "We are quite content as we are." Of course, said Mr. Pierce. But his smile suggested he was not a man easily put off. Tea was brought in, and as they settled to their cups and excellent seed cake, the conversation turned naturally to the subject of room 7. "The stories go back 50 years, said Neville, leaning against the mantelpiece with studied casualness. "A widow named Mrs. Ashcroft took the room one winter and was found dead in her bed. Natural causes, the doctor said. But ever since, people have reported strange things. Bells ringing when no one pulls them. The curtains stirring when there's no draft and always at midnight. A woman's face at the window." "Poppycock?" said Mr. Pierce comfortably. "Though I confess it adds a certain frisson to one's stay. I'm looking forward to a quiet night in the haunted chamber." Madame Zora closed her eyes. "I sense a widow," she intoned. "A widow who waits. Death lies where she laid her head." "How perfectly thrilling," said Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes, very bright and shrewd behind her spectacles, traveled thoughtfully from face to face, and then to the bellboard hanging on the wall beside the parlor door, where a row of little labels marked each room of the inn. The label for room 7, she noticed, appeared rather less dusty than the others, as though it had been handled recently. She smiled gently and took another sip of her tea. Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, and somewhere in the depths of the old house, a board creaked softly, as old houses will. Chapter 2. Midnight Bells and a Face at the Window. Christmas Eve dawned gray and bitterly cold, with fresh snow falling steadily throughout the morning. By afternoon, the Holly and Ivy Inn was thoroughly cut off from the outside world, though no one seemed to mind particularly. The parlor fire blazed cheerfully, and Mrs. Rowan's kitchen sent forth the most promising smells of roasting goose and plum pudding. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet observation. She noted that Neville Rowan made frequent trips to the cellar, always returning with fewer bottles than seemed strictly necessary for the modest number of guests. She observed that Mr. Pierce spent considerable time in conversation with Mrs. Rowan in the small office behind the bar, conversations that left the widow's face set in lines of controlled displeasure. She noticed that Madame Zora's theatrical pronouncements were always delivered when Mr. Qualls was present, as though the medium sought an audience who might appreciate the performance. Mrs. Bantry, for her part, was having a thoroughly enjoyable time. She had discovered that the inn possessed a fascinating collection of old coaching prints, and she spent a pleasant hour examining them with Mr. Qualls, who proved to be unexpectedly knowledgeable about Victorian transportation. "I use them in my stage work," he explained with a slight smile. "The visual elements of an illusion are everything. One must understand perspective, sight lines, the way the eye can be misdirected." "How clever," said Mrs. Bantry. "Rather like a murder mystery, I should think, making people look at the wrong things." "Precisely," said Mr. Qualls. His eyes drifted to where Madame Zora sat in state by the fire, though some practitioners are more subtle than others. By early evening, the entire party had gathered in the parlor. The Reverend Clement Dane had arrived with his pretty young wife, Griselda, both of them pink-cheeked from the cold and carrying a basket of holly and ivy for decorating. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, had managed to drive through the snow and now stood warming himself at the fire with a glass of hot whiskey punch. "Couldn't miss Christmas Eve at the Holly and Ivy," he declared. "Best punch in the county, and Mrs. Rowan's mince pies are worth risking the drifts for." The punch was indeed excellent, and Miss Marple accepted a small glass with murmured thanks. She sipped it carefully, noting its warmth and the pleasant spicing, while her eyes continued their gentle surveillance of the company. Oswell Pierce was particularly jovial, having consumed rather more punch than was perhaps wise. He had been holding forth about his plans for the inn should he acquire it. "Modernization, that's the ticket," he said expansively. "Electric heating throughout, new furniture, perhaps even a cocktail bar. This ghost business is all very well for attracting custom, but one must move with the times." Mrs. Rowan's expression suggested she would prefer to move Mr. Pierce out into the snowdrifts, but she maintained her composed silence. Neville, however, was less restrained. "The inn has character precisely because it isn't modern," he said, his voice tight. "Not everything worth having can be measured in profit margins." "My dear boy," said Pierce with patronizing good humor, "sentiment is all very well, but it doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Before Neville could reply, Madame Zora rose dramatically to her feet. "I feel the spirits gathering," she announced. "The veil grows thin on this holy night. I shall conduct a séance. Those with courage may join me." Mrs. Bantry was immediately enthusiastic. Dr. Haydock looked skeptical but amused. The Reverend Clement appeared torn between pastoral duty and curiosity, while Griselda frankly begged to be included. "I've never seen a real séance," she said eagerly. "I'm not certain it's quite the thing for Christmas Eve," began Clement, but his wife overruled him with the cheerful ruthlessness of young love. They arranged themselves around a small table that Neville dragged into position. The lamps were dimmed. Madame Zora closed her eyes and began to breathe heavily. Her hands spread flat on the table surface. Miss Marple, who had declined to join the circle, sat quietly in the shadows with her knitting. Mr. Qualls had also abstained, choosing instead to light a cigarette and watch the proceedings with an expression of professional interest. For several minutes, nothing happened except that Madame Zora's breathing grew louder and more theatrical. Then suddenly she spoke in a voice quite different from her own, higher and more wavering. "Cold," she whispered. So cold, alone. Waiting. Death comes where a widow lays her head. Mrs. Bantry shivered pleasurably. Griselda clutched her husband's hand. "Who are you?" asked Pierce, entering into the spirit of the thing with tipsy enthusiasm. "What do you want?" "Room 7, came the whispered reply. "Room 7, where I died. Tonight death will come again." It was at that moment, at precisely 3 minutes before midnight, by Miss Marple's small watch, that the bellboard on the wall gave a distinct quiver. Everyone turned to look. In the dimness, they could just make out the row of bells and labels. One of the bells, the one marked clearly as Room 7, began to swing. It gave 2 distinct silvery chimes. Several people cried out. Madame Zora's eyes flew open, and for a moment her expression was one of genuine surprise. Before she recovered her professional manner, "The spirits manifest," she said dramatically, but Miss Marple was looking at Neville. Rowan, he had gone quite pale, and his eyes were fixed on the bellboard with an expression that might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. Dr. Haydock strode to the board and examined it closely. "Damned odd," he muttered. "No one pulled anything." It was then that Mrs. Bantry, who had gone to the window, gave a genuine shriek. "Look, oh, look at Room 7's window!" They all rushed to see. There, clearly visible in the dormer window directly above them, was the pale silhouette of a woman's face. It appeared for perhaps 5 seconds, ghostly and distinct against the darkness of the room beyond, and then vanished as suddenly as it had come. The effect was electric. Even Dr. Haydock looked shaken. Griselda had gone quite white, and the Reverend Clement was murmuring something that might have been a prayer. Only Mr. Qualls seemed unmoved. "Most effective," he said quietly. "Quite the best I've seen in years." Pierce, who'd been staring at the window with an expression of mingled fascination and unease, laughed rather too loudly. "Well," he said, "I suppose I'm in for an interesting night. I'm not a superstitious man, but I confess that was rather unnerving." "You're not seriously going to sleep in Room 7 tonight," said Griselda. "After that?" "My dear young lady," said Pierce, drawing himself up with the dignity of several glasses of punch, "I've paid good money for that room, and I'm not about to be frightened off by parlor tricks." Ghosts indeed. Load of nonsense. But Miss Marple noticed that his hands shook slightly as he set down his glass. The party broke up shortly after midnight. The Reverend Clement and Griselda departed for the vicarage, promising to return for Christmas dinner. Dr. Haydock left soon after, and the remaining guests began to drift upstairs. Pierce went last, having fortified himself with a final glass of punch. As he climbed the stairs, he called back with forced joviality, "If I'm not down for breakfast, you'll know the ghost got me." No one laughed. Miss Marple retired to Room 6 and sat for some time in the darkness, looking across the corridor at the firmly closed door of Room 7. A thin line of light showed beneath it for perhaps 20 minutes, and then went out. The inn settled into silence. Miss Marple remained at her post, knitting quietly, her needles making soft clicking sounds in the darkness. At 7 on Christmas morning, the maid's screams echoed through the Holly and Ivy Inn. Miss Marple was first to the corridor, wrapped in her dressing gown, arriving even before Mrs. Rowan. The maid stood before Room 7's door, her face gray with shock. "He don't answer, ma'am," she gasped. "I knocked and there's no answer at all." Mrs. Rowan tried the handle. The door was fast. "Mr. Pierce," she called firmly. "Mr. Pierce, are you quite well?" Silence. Neville appeared, hastily dressed, followed by Mr. Qualls and Madame Zora. Mrs. Bantry emerged from her room with her hair in papers, looking thrilled and horrified in equal measure. "Break it down," said Mrs. Rowan sharply. It took Neville and Mr. Qualls together to force the door, and when it finally gave way, they stumbled into the room to find a sight that would not soon be forgotten. Oswell Pierce lay on the bed, fully dressed save for his shoes. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a peculiar fixed expression. His face had a faint cherry tinge that Dr. Haydock, arriving breathless 10 minutes later, identified immediately. Asphyxia, he said grimly. Carbon monoxide, most likely, though I'll need to examine him properly. The room was utterly undisturbed. The window was fast. The bolt was still shot on the door from the inside. The fire had not been lit. The key lay on the bedside table. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, having been summoned from market basing. He stood in the doorway of room 7, his face grim, and said the words that would echo through the investigation to come. Sealed room, locked from the inside. No weapon, no wounds, nothing disturbed. Either this is the perfect murder, or the ghost of room 7 has claimed another victim. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back of the gathering, said nothing at all. But her eyes were very bright, and her fingers moved thoughtfully over her knitting needles, as though working out a particularly complex pattern. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices dust on the bellboard. Inspector Slack was not a man who welcomed interference in his investigations, and the presence of Miss Marple hovering gently at the edges of his crime scene did nothing to improve his temper. Now then, Miss Marple, he said with heavy patience, I'm sure you'd be more comfortable downstairs with Mrs. Bantry. This is police business. Of course, Inspector, said Miss Marple mildly. I was merely concerned about the draft. The corridor is quite cold, with poor Mr. Pierce's door standing open. Perhaps someone might close it. The door stays open until I've finished, snapped Slack. And there's no draft to speak of. No, agreed Miss Marple. There isn't, is there? How curious. She moved away down the corridor with her usual unhurried gait, but Slack noticed with irritation that she paused by the bellboard that hung on the wall near the stairs. She stood there for some moments, her head tilted to one side like an inquisitive bird, before descending to the parlor below. Dr. Haydock emerged from room 7 looking grave. Well? Demanded Slack. Classic presentation of carbon monoxide poisoning, said Haydock. The cherry-pink discoloration of the skin, the open eyes, the position of the body. He would have lost consciousness fairly quickly, never knowing what was happening. But where did the gas come from? Slack gestured at the cold fireplace. Fire wasn't lit, no gas pipes in these old rooms. That said, Haydock, he added, is your puzzle, not mine. But I can tell you, he's been dead since sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. When the doctor had gone, Slack stood in the doorway of room 7 and surveyed the scene with mounting frustration. Everything was in order. The bed had been slept upon, but not under the covers. Pierce's shoes stood neatly by the dresser. His watch lay on the bedside table, stopped at midnight. The window was latched from within. The door had been bolted. The bolt only gave way when they forced the door. A perfect sealed room. Slack's gaze fell on the hearth. There, rather incongruously, sat a small chafing dish of the sort used in better households for keeping food warm. It contained the gray remains of spent charcoal. Now what? Muttered Slack. What was he doing with that? He bent closer. The charcoal had burned completely, leaving only ash. But when he examined the fireplace itself, he frowned. The hearthstone showed no sign of soot or smoke staining. The flue cheeks were clean. For charcoal that had clearly burned for some hours, there ought to have been some residue. Slack made careful notes, then turned his attention to the door mechanism. The bolt was a simple brass affair, the sort found in every Victorian house. It slid smoothly in its housing, and there was nothing remarkable about it, save for one detail, a tiny scratch mark on the bolt tongue itself, as though something had rubbed against it recently. He was still pondering this when a soft cough from the corridor made him turn sharply. Miss Marple stood there, a cup of tea in her hand. "Mrs. Rowan thought you might like some refreshment, Inspector," she said. "I offered to bring it up as I was coming this way." "That's kind." "I'm sure," said Slack ungraciously, taking the cup. "Though I don't recall you saying you were coming upstairs." "Oh, I needed to fetch my spectacles," said Miss Marple vaguely. "I believe I left them in my room. One becomes so forgetful." She drifted past him toward room 6, and Slack returned to his examination of the scene. It was only later that it occurred to him Miss Marple had been wearing her spectacles the entire time. Downstairs in the parlor, Mrs. Bantry was holding court with the remaining guests. Madame Zora had taken to her bed with what she claimed was spiritual exhaustion. Mr. Qualls sat quietly by the fire, and Neville Rowan stood behind the bar with a stunned expression of a man whose world had turned upside down. "It's dreadful," Mrs. Bantry was saying. "Poor Mr. Pierce, though I must say, dying in a haunted room does have a certain Gothic quality to it." "Dolly," said Miss Marple, entering the parlor, "you're quite incorrigible. But Jane, you must admit it's extraordinary. A locked room. No apparent cause of death. And after those manifestations last night?" "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "The manifestations were certainly remarkable." She crossed to the bellboard and stood before it once more. The morning light from the corridor window fell across it clearly now, and what she saw confirmed her earlier observation. The board was old, installed perhaps 30 years ago, when such devices were still common in better establishments. Each bell was connected by wire to a pull in the corresponding room, and each was labeled with a small brass tag. The tags were tarnished with age, and a fine film of dust lay over most of them, the accumulated grime of years of inadequate cleaning in hard-to-reach places. But the tag labeled Room 7 was different. It gleamed more brightly than its neighbors, and the small clapper that struck the bell showed distinct finger marks, as though someone had handled it recently and often. Miss Marple produced a clean handkerchief from her sleeve and gently touched one of the other tags. The handkerchief came away with a distinct copper-colored smudge. She repeated the experiment with the Room 7 tag. The handkerchief remained spotless. "How very interesting," she murmured. "What is?" asked Mrs. Bantry, appearing at her elbow. "This bell has been polished quite recently," said Miss Marple, "while the others have not been touched in years. One wonders why." Mr. Qualls had risen and now stood examining the board with professional interest. "The wiring would run up through the walls," he observed. Victorian engineering was really quite ingenious. A simple pulley system, but effective. "Yes," agreed Miss Marple. "Though I wonder if all the wires still function properly. In a house of this age, one might expect some deterioration." She moved away toward the back of the house, following the corridor that led to the pantry and kitchen regions. Mrs. Bantry trailed after her, intrigued. The pantry was a small, dim room, smelling of silver polish and old wood. Along one wall hung a series of bell pulls, each corresponding to a room above. They were stiff with disuse, save for one or two that showed signs of more recent employment. Miss Marple examined the pull labeled Room 7. Unlike the others, its braided surface showed a distinct smudge of some greasy substance. She touched it delicately with one finger, then sniffed. "Tallow," she said, "as from a candle." "I don't understand," said Mrs. Bantry. "Someone has handled this pull recently," explained Miss Marple, "and they were carrying a candle at the time. One might ask oneself why anyone would need a candle in the pantry when there is perfectly adequate electric lighting." "To see something one did not wish to be seen seeing," suggested Mrs. Bantry, warming to the game. "Precisely, my dear." They returned to the corridor outside Room 7. Inspector Slack had finally emerged and was questioning Mrs. Rowan in clipped, unsatisfied tones. Miss Marple paid them no attention. Instead, she bent with some difficulty and examined the floor beneath the door of the death chamber. "Jane, whatever are you doing?" hissed Mrs. Bantry. "Looking at dust, dear," said Miss Marple, rising with the aid of Mrs. Bantry's arm. "Very instructive dust. This particular line of dust is greasy, you see, as though warm air had seeped under the door and drawn particles along with it." "But that would mean the room was warm," said Mrs. Bantry. "Yet the fire wasn't lit." "Exactly," said Miss Marple, "which suggests the warmth came from another source entirely." She gazed at the closed door of room 7 with an expression of mild concentration. "Carbon monoxide," she said almost to herself. Dr. Haydock is quite certain. One naturally thinks of motor cars and faulty heating, but this room has neither. "Then how?" demanded Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple's answer was forestalled by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who informed them with barely concealed triumph that he had discovered something significant in room 7, and would they please return to the parlor and await his questions. As they descended the stairs, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Do you know what happened, Jane?" "I am beginning to form a theory," said Miss Marple, "though there are still several points that require clarification. The bellboard, you see, and the curious matter of the tallow on the bell pull, and why, if someone wished to harm Mr. Pierce, they would choose such an extraordinarily elaborate method." "Perhaps they wanted it to look like the ghost," suggested Mrs. Bantry. "Perhaps," agreed Miss Marple, "or perhaps they wanted it to look like something it was not, which is rather interesting when one thinks about it carefully." She settled into her chair by the pile of fire and took up her knitting once more, her needles clicking steadily as her mind worked through the problem with the methodical patience of long practice. Chapter 4. Charcoal Without Smoke. Inspector. Slack's discovery proved to be the chafing dish in the hearth, though what significance he attached to it remained unclear to those assembled in the parlor when he descended to question them. "Now then," he said, consulting his notebook with the air of a man who has caught someone in a clever trap, "who brought a chafing dish into room 7? There was a moment of bewildered silence. "A chafing dish?" repeated Mrs. Rowan. "I cannot imagine why anyone would. We use them occasionally in the dining room for keeping dishes warm at table, but certainly not in the guest rooms." "Nevertheless," said Slack heavily, "there is one in room 7 at this moment. Contains spent charcoal, burned right down to ash." "How very peculiar," said Mr. Qualls, "though I suppose if Mr. Pierce felt cold, he might have requested something to warm the room." "The fire was laid ready for lighting," said Mrs. Rowan with some asperity. "Had Mr. Pierce wished for warmth, he had only to put a match to it." Neville Rowan had gone rather pale. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "We do sometimes use the chafing dishes for warming mince pies," he offered, "during the Christmas season. Perhaps one was taken upstairs by mistake." "By whom?" demanded Slack. "I couldn't say," said Neville. "The kitchen is busy at this time of year. Any of the staff might have moved it." Miss Marple, who had been knitting placidly throughout this exchange, now looked up with an expression of gentle inquiry. "Inspector, might I ask whether the charcoal had burned completely?" Slack frowned at her. "Yes, down to ash." "What of it? And was there any smoke staining in the fireplace? On the hearthstones, perhaps, or the chimney breast?" "No," admitted Slack. "Clean as a whistle, which struck me as odd, I'll grant you." "Not odd at all," said Miss Marple. "Charcoal burns very cleanly, you see, no smoke to speak of. That is why it is used for cooking in certain circumstances, and why it is preferred for chafing dishes. One would not wish smoke in the dining room." Dr. Haydock, who had returned for the questioning, nodded slowly. "That's quite right," he said. "Charcoal combustion is remarkably clean, but it consumes oxygen, and in a confined space—" He paused, his expression changing. Good Lord, in a sealed room, burning charcoal would produce carbon monoxide as the oxygen was depleted. Precisely, said Miss Marple. Slack's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting someone put that chafing dish in Pierce's room deliberately to poison him? I am suggesting nothing, Inspector, said Miss Marple mildly. I am merely observing that charcoal, while producing no visible smoke, can be quite dangerous in an unventilated space. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. But Jane, the window was fastened and the door was bolted. How perfectly diabolical. If it was deliberate, put in Mr. Qualls quietly, it was certainly clever. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. The victim would have no warning. Mrs. Rowan had risen, her face troubled. Inspector, I must protest. No one in my establishment would do such a thing. Mr. Pierce must have brought the chafing dish to his room himself, perhaps thinking to warm it. A tragic accident? Then why bolt the door? Asked Slack bluntly. Many people lock their doors at night, said Mrs. Rowan with dignity, particularly in a strange place. Miss Marple had set down her knitting and now rose with the aid of her walking stick. Inspector, would it be possible for me to observe the room once more? I promise not to disturb anything. Slack looked inclined to refuse, but Dr. Haydock intervened. Let her look, Slack. Miss Marple has a knack for noticing things. You know she does. With poor grace, Slack led the way upstairs. Miss Marple followed, moving slowly but with purpose. Mrs. Bantry came too, unwilling to miss anything of interest. Room 7 looked much as it had earlier, save that Pierce's body had been removed. The chafing dish still sat in the hearth, a silent witness to tragedy. Miss Marple approached it carefully, bending to examine it without touching. The dish was of good quality brass, tarnished with age, but serviceable. The charcoal within had indeed burned completely to fine gray ash. How long would such a quantity of charcoal burn? She asked Dr. Haydock. Several hours, he replied. 4 or 5, I should think, depending on the ventilation. And in a room of this size, how long before the air became dangerous? Haydock considered. Hard to say precisely. The room is not large. With the door bolted and window shut and a steady source of combustion. He calculated mentally. 2 hours, perhaps 3, before unconsciousness. Death would follow fairly quickly once the oxygen level dropped sufficiently. Miss Marple moved to the fireplace itself. She produced a handkerchief and held it near the opening, watching it closely. It hung perfectly still. No draft at all, she observed. One would expect some air movement from a chimney, even on a still day. She turned to Slack. Inspector, would it be possible to examine the chimney from above? The roof? Slack looked startled. In this weather? I believe it would be most instructive, said Miss Marple firmly. 20 minutes later, Neville Rowan had been persuaded to fetch a ladder and accompany Slack to the roof. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry waited in the yard below, wrapped in coats against the bitter cold. When Slack descended, his expression was grim. Chimney's blocked, he announced, and stuffed with something soft. Couldn't see clearly, but it's jammed in tight. How very interesting, said Miss Marple. And the snow around the chimney pot? Melted in a ring, said Slack slowly, though it's fallen fresh since there's a sort of crust, like something had been scattered there. He looked at Miss Marple with grudging respect. You knew, didn't you? I suspected, said Miss Marple. The room was warm enough to draw dust under the door, yet the fire was not lit. The charcoal burned for hours without any smoke escaping up the flue. That suggested the chimney was not drawing air as it should. Back in room 7, Dr. Haydock conducted a simple experiment. He lit a candle and held it near the bed. The flame guttered downward, bending toward the floor. Heavy air, he said. Carbon monoxide is slightly lighter than normal air, but in a sealed room, the combustion would deplete the oxygen at floor level first, creating this effect. Mrs. Bantry had been quiet during all of this, but now she spoke up. Jane, There's a canary in the bar. Mrs. Rowan keeps it for company. I saw it this morning. How thoughtful of you to remember, dear, said Miss Marple. The canary, brought upstairs in its cage by a mystified Mrs. Rowan, provided the final proof. Held near the open door of room 7, the little bird became noticeably distressed, its breathing rapid and labored. They removed it quickly to fresh air, where it recovered. The air in that room is still tainted, said Dr. Haydock grimly. Even with the door open, there are pockets of bad air remaining. Inspector Slack stood in the doorway, his face set in hard lines. This was murder, he said flatly. Deliberate and calculated. Someone blocked that chimney from the roof, put burning charcoal in a sealed room, and left Pierce to die. But who? Asked Mrs. Bantry. And how did they get out if the door was bolted from inside? Miss Marple returned to her examination of the door bolt. She traced its mechanism with her finger, following the line of the bolt housing. Her eyes were very bright indeed. That, my dear Dolly, she said softly, is the question that matters most, because whoever solved that problem is our murderer. She straightened, her gaze moving thoughtfully around the room, taking in the position of the bed, the door, the window, and finally coming to rest on something near the wainscoting that had escaped everyone's notice. Inspector, she said, I believe there is something you should see. Chapter 5. The Curtain That Moved with No Draft. What Miss Marple had noticed was so small that Inspector Slack required his magnifying glass to see it properly. On the wainscoting, perhaps 6 inches above the skirting board, a tiny brass eye had been screwed into the wood. It was new, the surrounding paint showing faint scratches where the tool had slipped during installation. Now what? Muttered Slack. What's that doing there? Miss Marple had moved to the window. The heavy velvet curtains hung to the floor in ponderous folds, their fabric faded by decades of sunlight to an indeterminate brownish hue. She ran her fingers carefully along the inner hem of the right-hand curtain, feeling the stitching with the delicate touch of one accustomed to needlework. Inspector, she said presently, would you be so kind as to bring your glass here? Slack joined her, and she indicated a spot on the hem. There, cunningly sewn into the selvage, where it would be invisible unless one was specifically searching, was a small hook and eye, the sort used in dressmaking. Good Lord, said Dr. Haydock, peering over Slack's shoulder. Is that what moved the curtain last night? I believe so, said Miss Marple, though the mechanism is not yet entirely clear. She traced the line of the curtain downward, examining the floor beneath. The ancient Turkey carpet was thick with dust in the corners where the maid's broom had not reached, and there, almost invisible against the pattern, lay a length of black thread. It was strong thread, the sort used for outdoor work or upholstery, and it ran from the hook in the curtain hem across the floor to the brass eye on the wainscoting. From there it disappeared beneath the skirting board, following a gap where age had shrunk the wood. Where does it go? Demanded Slack. Shall we follow it and see? Suggested Miss Marple. The thread, when traced with care, ran along the base of the wall and out beneath the door of room 7. In the corridor it continued, barely visible against the dark runner, until it reached the head of the stairs. There it descended, tucked into the angle where wall met stair, all the way to the parlor below. In the parlor, the thread's terminus required some furniture rearranging to discover. Behind the heavy oak settle that stood against the wall directly below room 7, the thread reappeared, tied securely to a nail that had been driven into the wainscoting. Mrs. Bantry stared at the arrangement with dawning comprehension. Someone could sit here, she said slowly, and pull the thread, and the curtain upstairs would move. Precisely, said Miss Marple, though not very far, a gentle stirring, barely noticeable, but in a room said to be haunted, quite sufficient to alarm the superstitious. Mr. Qualls had been examining the mechanism with professional admiration. Quite elegant, he said. Simple but effective. The thread is nearly invisible against dark surfaces, and the movement would appear entirely supernatural to someone not versed in stage mechanics. But who set it up? Asked Mrs. Rowan, who had followed them downstairs. Her face was pale, her composure badly shaken. Who would do such a thing? Someone with access to both floors, said Slack grimly. Someone who knew the house well enough to run thread through it without being observed. Neville Rowan, who'd been standing silently by the bar, spoke up suddenly. It was me, he said flatly. The room went very quiet. You? Said his stepmother. Neville, what are you saying? I rigged the curtain trick, Neville continued, his voice tight. Weeks ago, when Madame Zora first began talking about the haunting, I thought it would be amusing, good for custom, a bit of theater to entertain the guests. But the curtain moved last night, said Slack, when Pierce saw the face at the window. Yes, said Neville miserably. I pulled the thread. I was sitting behind the settle during the séance, but I never meant... I didn't kill Pierce. You must believe that. Mrs. Rowan had sunk into a chair, her face ashen. Oh, Neville, she said quietly. What have you done? Miss Marple, who had been listening intently, now spoke with gentle firmness. Mr. Rowan, the curtain trick was used last night to create the appearance of supernatural activity, but was that its only purpose? Neville looked confused. What else would it be for? That is what we must discover, said Miss Marple. You see, the thread pulled the curtain. But what created the face that appeared in the window? There was a moment of startled silence. I saw it. Clearly, said Mrs. Bantry, a woman's face, pale and ghostly. As did I, confirmed Dr. Haydock. Quite distinct against the darkness of the room. Then something must have been positioned at the window, said Mr. Qualls thoughtfully. A mask, perhaps, or a picture of some kind, arranged to catch what little light there was. But we found nothing of the sort in the room, protested Slack. I examined every inch. Which suggests, said Miss Marple, that whatever created the apparition was removed before the body was discovered by someone who had access to the room after Mr. Pierce was dead. Impossible, said Slack. The door was bolted from inside. Nevertheless, said Miss Marple, it must have been done. The face was seen. The face is now gone. Therefore, someone removed it. She returned her attention to Neville. Mr. Rowan, when you pulled the thread last night, what exactly did you see? Neville swallowed hard. I was behind the settle. I couldn't see the window from there. I just pulled the thread when Madame Zora began her performance, to create atmosphere, and afterward I tied it off and went to the bar. Pierce was already heading upstairs. He looked nervous, but determined. Did anyone else go upstairs after Mr. Pierce retired? Neville hesitated. I don't think so. The parlor was full. We were all talking about what we'd seen. Madame Zora, who had finally emerged from her room, swept into the parlor at that moment, her purple draperies trailing dramatically. The spirits are disturbed, she announced. I sense great wickedness in this house. Yes, well, that's very helpful, I'm sure, said Slack with heavy sarcasm. Perhaps your spirits can tell us who murdered Pierce. Madame Zora drew herself up with offended dignity. The spirits do not concern themselves with mere murder. How convenient, muttered Slack. Miss Marple, however, was studying the medium with thoughtful interest. Madame Zora, she said courteously, you insisted upon sitting in the parlor below room 7 last night. Why was that? I felt the presence most strongly there, said Madame Zora. The widow's spirit calls from that room. And you were in trance until what time? Past midnight. The spirits held me for nearly an hour. I see, said Miss Marple. How very exhausting for you. She turned back to the thread mechanism, following its path once more with her eyes. Something about it troubled her. some detail that did not quite fit the pattern she was forming. "Inspector," she said presently, "I wonder if we might examine the other rooms on the upper floor, particularly those adjacent to room 7. "Why?" asked Slack suspiciously. "Because," said Miss Marple, "if someone wished to create elaborate hauntings, they would need not just access to the room itself, but to the spaces around it. And I'm beginning to think that this particular ghost had rather more material requirements than most." She smiled gently, but her eyes were very sharp indeed, as they moved from face to face around the parlor, weighing, assessing, piecing together the puzzle that was slowly revealing itself. "Ghosts," she observed almost to herself, "are so often blamed for things that are really quite explicable. But then, that is rather the point, is it not? To make the explicable seem supernatural, one need only arrange matters properly." Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered, but Mr. Qualls was nodding slowly, his expression one of dawning understanding. "The art of misdirection," he said quietly. "Show them one mystery while concealing another." "Exactly," said Miss Marple, "and I rather think that is what happened here." Chapter 6. Salt on the Roof, Soot on a Scarf. The exploration of the upper floor proved instructive, though not in ways that Inspector Slack had anticipated. Miss Marple moved from room to room with her usual unhurried thoroughness, examining windows, testing drafts, and occasionally making small observations that seemed irrelevant until one considered them more carefully. It was in the corridor, however, that she paused longest. The window at the far end looked out over the yard and outbuildings, and from it one could see the roofline quite clearly. The snow lay thick and white across the slates, undisturbed, save where the chimneys rose like dark sentinels. "Inspector," said Miss Marple, "you mentioned that the snow around room 7's chimney had melted in a ring." "That's right," said Slack, "though fresh snow's fallen since, so it's not as clear now." "Nevertheless," said Miss Marple, "I think we should examine it again, if you would be so kind as to fetch Mr. Rowan and the ladder once more." Slack looked as though he would prefer to do almost anything else, but he complied. Within a quarter hour, he and Neville were once again on the roof, this time with Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry watching from the window above rather than the yard below. The chimney pot of room 7 stood perhaps 10 feet from the window, accessible by walking carefully along the roof valley. Fresh snow had indeed fallen, but beneath it, visible where Slack's earlier visit had disturbed the surface, was a peculiar crust. Slack bent and scooped up a handful. When he brought it to his nose, his expression changed. "Salt," he called across to the window, mixed in with the snow. "Deliberate, I'd say. Why would someone put salt on the roof?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "To melt the snow and conceal footprints," said Miss Marple quietly. "If one wished to approach the chimney without leaving obvious tracks, scattering salt would cause the snow to melt into a general wet mess rather than showing distinct boot prints." "Clever," said Mrs. Bantry grudgingly. "Rather horrid, but clever." When Slack and Neville returned to ground level, both were cold, and Neville was looking increasingly wretched. They reconvened in the parlor, where Mrs. Rowan had ordered hot coffee for everyone. Miss Marple accepted her cup with thanks but set it aside almost immediately. She had noticed something that required investigation. Near the door that led to the kitchen and scullery regions, a row of pegs held outdoor garments belonging to the household. Neville's country coat hung there along with his scarf and cap. Miss Marple rose and moved toward them with apparent aimlessness. "Such a useful thing, a woolen scarf," she observed, touching the fabric lightly. "I always advise young people to wrap up properly in this weather." The scarf was of good quality, woven in a check pattern of gray and brown. Miss Marple examined it with the same careful attention she had given to everything else, and what she found made her eyes sharpen with interest. On one end of the scarf, barely visible against the dark wool, was a faint smudge of black. It was not the ordinary grime one might acquire from handling coal or wood. The texture was finer, more like powder. She produced a handkerchief and gently rubbed the mark. The fabric came away gray-black with a distinct oily quality. "Soot," she said quietly. Neville, who had been warming his hands at the fire, turned sharply. "What?" "Your scarf has soot on it, Mr. Rowan," said Miss Marple. "Fresh soot, I should say, not the sort one gets from a fireplace." "I expect I got it checking the flue," said Neville quickly. "We maintain the chimneys properly. I was up on the roof only last week." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "But this soot is very fresh, and there is something else." She had been examining the weave of the scarf more closely, and now she extracted something with her fingernails. It was a small feather, gray, white, and downy, caught in the wool fibers. "A feather," said Dr. Haydock, leaning in to look. "Goose down?" "I think not," said Miss Marple. "The texture is finer. This is from a pillow, I believe, the sort of good-quality down pillow one finds in better households." There was a moment of frozen silence. "The chimney was blocked with a pillow," said Slack slowly. "Or pillow-ticking, at any rate." All eyes turned to Neville. He had gone very white, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't know how that got there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Rowan rose, her face stricken. "Neville," she said, and there was both command and pleading in her tone. "Tell the truth." "I am telling the truth." His voice rose desperately. "Yes, I was on the roof. I went up yesterday afternoon to check for ice dams. We've had trouble with them before. I might have brushed against the chimney, that's all." "And the pillow feather?" asked Miss Marple gently. "I don't know. Perhaps from making up rooms. The maid shakes out pillows near the scullery door. I could have picked it up anywhere." But Inspector Slack was no longer listening. He had crossed to examine the scarf himself, and his face was grim. "This soot didn't come from checking chimneys in the normal way," he said. "This is the kind of smudge you get from handling something that's been used to block a flue from forcing it into a narrow space." "That's speculation," said Mr. Qualls. Quietly, "The boy says he was checking for ice dams in the afternoon," said Slack, "before the murder." "That's convenient." "It's the truth," insisted Neville. Miss Marple had returned to her chair and taken up her knitting once more. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes remained fixed on Neville with an expression that might have been compassion, or might have been something sharper. "Mr. Rowan," she said presently, "you mentioned you were in debt." "To whom?" Neville's jaw tightened. "That's my private business." "Was it Mr. Pierce?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Mrs. Rowan made a small sound of distress. "Neville, you never told me." "What was there to tell?" said Neville bitterly. "That I'd been a fool? That I'd gambled away money I didn't have? Pierce held my notes. He was going to call them in unless we sold him the inn at his price." "So you had motive," said Slack flatly. "Motive isn't murder," said Mr. Qualls. "Half the world has motive to kill someone. It's means and opportunity that matter." "He had those too," said Slack. "He knows the house. He admitted rigging the curtain trick. He was on the roof with access to the chimney. He has soot on his scarf and pillow down in the weave." "Circumstantial," said Mr. Qualls, but he looked troubled. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose. "Inspector," she said, "before you proceed further, there are still several points that require clarification. The door bolt, for instance, and the question of how the chafing dish came to be in room 7, and the matter of timing." "What about timing?" demanded Slack. "Mr. Pierce retired to his room shortly after midnight," said Miss Marple. "The charcoal would have taken several hours to produce fatal quantities of carbon monoxide. Yet the door was found bolted from within this morning. If someone placed the chafing dish in the room, How did they leave and still secure the bolt? Perhaps Pierce bolted it himself, suggested Slack. Perhaps, agreed Miss Marple. But if so, when was the chafing dish introduced? And by whom? She looked around the assembled company with her mild, persistent gaze. You see, she said gently, a murder of this complexity requires not just planning, but execution. Someone had to block the chimney, introduce the burning charcoal, and ensure the room was sealed. All this while avoiding detection, and while the victim was either present or shortly to arrive. It could have been done earlier, said Slack, hours before Pierce went up to bed. It could, agreed Miss Marple, but that would be remarkably risky. Anyone entering the room before Mr. Pierce might have noticed the chafing dish or smelled the charcoal. No, I think the arrangements were made much closer to the crucial time. Which brings us back to the question of opportunity. She paused, her eyes distant, as though calculating something in her mind. We must establish exactly where everyone was, she continued, between 11:30 on Christmas Eve and 1 on Christmas morning. That is when this murder was committed, and I suspect we shall find the answer most illuminating. Chapter 7. Alibi by Pudding, Carols, and Cellar. Inspector Slack produced his notebook with the air of a man preparing for battle. The task of establishing a precise timeline was complicated by the festive chaos of Christmas Eve, when people had been moving about freely, sampling punch, singing carols, and generally paying little attention to anything beyond the immediate merriment. Nevertheless, Slack was determined to pin down each person's movements. Right then, he said grimly. Mrs. Rowan, we'll start with you. Where were you from 11:30 until 1? Mrs. Rowan straightened in her chair, her composure returning now that she was on familiar ground of household routine. I was plating Christmas puddings in the kitchen, she said firmly. We make individual puddings for Boxing Day distribution to the village. I worked until 20 minutes to midnight, then supervised the locking of the kitchen door and scullery. The maid can confirm I was there throughout. And after that, I went to the linen cupboard to check supplies. Mrs. Dane found me there at 5 minutes to midnight when she came looking for an extra blanket. We spoke briefly. Then I returned to the kitchen to ensure the range was properly banked for the night. Griselda Dane, when summoned from the vicarage where she had returned, confirmed this account. I saw Mrs. Rowan in the passage by the linen cupboard, she said. It must have been just before midnight because the church bells began ringing as I went back downstairs. Slack made careful notes, then turned to Neville. And you, Mr. Rowan? Neville's hands were shaking slightly as he answered. I was serving in the bar until 10 minutes past midnight. We were busy. Several locals had come in for Christmas drinks. Arthur the potman was helping me. Then I went down to the cellar to fetch up more ale. We were running low on the bitter. What time was this? Just after midnight, 1:15 perhaps. Slack looked up sharply. How long were you in the cellar? 10 minutes, maybe 15. Arthur heard me down there. He called down to ask which cask I wanted brought up. Next, the potman, a stolid man of 50 with a weathered face of someone who worked outdoors, nodded confirmation when questioned. I heard him in the cellar, he said. Midnight or thereabouts, rattling about with the casks. Could you see him? Asked Miss Marple gently. Arthur looked surprised by the question. No, ma'am. Cellar stairs are steep and the door was mostly shut, but I heard him right enough. I see, said Miss Marple. Thank you. Slack turned his attention to Madame Zora, who had been sitting in dramatic silence throughout the proceedings. You were entranced during the séance, he said flatly. Until what time? The spirits released me at 5 minutes past midnight, she said in her resonant voice. I retired immediately to my room. The vibrations had exhausted me utterly. Did anyone see you go upstairs? The maid saw me, said Madame Zora. She was in the corridor. She remarked upon my veil. I recall. The maid, when fetched, confirmed this nervously. "Yes, sir, I seen her on the stairs. Her purple veil were trailing behind her, just after midnight it were." "And Mr. Qualls?" Slack consulted his notes. "You were where?" "In the porch," said Mr. Qualls calmly, "smoking with Reverend Dane." We stepped outside shortly before the bells rang and remained there for some minutes watching the snowfall. Rather peaceful, actually. The Reverend Clement, still present, nodded agreement. "That's quite right. We stood together until 10 minutes past midnight at least. Then I accompanied the carolers who'd arrived. They sang 3 hymns before departing, so you have each other as alibi," said Slack. "It would appear so," said Mr. Qualls. With a slight smile, Miss Marple had been following this recitation with close attention, her fingers moving rhythmically with her knitting needles. Now she looked up. "And Mr. Pierce? When did he retire to his room?" 3 minutes past midnight," said Mrs. Bantry promptly. "I remember because the church bells had just finished. He made that joke about hoping the ghost wouldn't disturb his sleep and went upstairs. Did anyone see him after that?" Silence greeted this question. Pierce had apparently gone to his room and been seen by no one until his body was discovered in the morning. Slack leaned back, his expression dissatisfied. So between midnight and 1:15, nearly everyone was occupied elsewhere. Mrs. Rowan in the kitchen, Neville in the cellar, Madame Zora going to her room, Mr. Qualls and the vicar in the porch, which means, said Dr. Haydock slowly, that any of them could have slipped away for a few minutes without being definitively accounted for. "Not Mrs. Rowan," protested the maid. "I seen her in the kitchen at 5 to 12, like she said." "But not continuously," pointed out Slack. "She could have left after you saw her." Mrs. Rowan's face flushed with indignation. "I did no such thing. I have run this establishment honestly for 15 years. I would never—" "No one is accusing you," said Miss Marple quickly. "But we must consider all possibilities." "Inspector, what of the bells?" "You said they rang at 3 minutes before midnight." "That's right," said Slack. "Several people heard them. The room 7 bell on the board downstairs." "And where were you at that moment, Mr. Rowan?" asked Miss Marple. "Behind the bar," said Neville. "I was drawing a pint for old Weatherby. I heard the bells, same as everyone." "Could you have pulled the bell wire in the pantry?" "No, I was in plain sight of a dozen people." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I rather thought so, which presents us with an interesting problem." "What problem?" demanded Slack. "If Mr. Rowan was visible in the bar when the bells rang, then someone else must have pulled the wire. Yet Mr. Rowan himself rigged the curtain trick, which suggests either an accomplice." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Or the bells were rung by some other mechanism entirely." "Finished, Mr. Qualls," he said dryly. "I confess I cannot think how, unless someone else knew of the thread arrangement." "Perhaps they did," said Miss Marple. "After all, the inn is not large. A careful observer might have discovered Mr. Rowan's theatrical additions." She turned to Madame Zora. "You spent considerable time in the parlor below. Room 7. Did you notice anything unusual about the wainscoting or the settle?" Madame Zora drew her shawls more tightly about her. "I sense only spirits, not mechanisms." "How very convenient," murmured Mrs. Bantry. Inspector Slack rose and paced the length of the parlor, his frustration evident. "What we have," he said, "is a victim who went to his room at 3 minutes past midnight. A chimney that had been blocked some time earlier, leaving traces of soot and feather on Neville Rowan's scarf. Charcoal burning in a chafing dish, though no one admits to putting it there. A room that was sealed from within, yet the murderer had to escape somehow. And a house full of people, each with a few minutes unaccounted for during the crucial time." "You're forgetting something, Inspector," said Miss Marple quietly. "What's that?" "The speaking tube," she said. "Or rather the question of whether there is one." In houses of this vintage, it was common to install tubes between floors for summoning servants. If such a tube exists between the parlor and room 7, it might explain several things. Slack stared at her. A speaking tube? What good would that do? It would, said Miss Marple, rising from her chair with deliberate purpose. Allow someone downstairs to communicate with someone upstairs, to give instructions, perhaps, or warnings, or to position a victim in exactly the right spot for what was to come. She moved toward the wainscoting behind the settle, her eyes searching. Yes, she said softly. I believe we should look very carefully at this wall. Very carefully indeed. Chapter 8. The Speaking Tube in the Wainscoting. The parlor settle was a massive oak piece, dark with age and wear, that had likely stood against the same wall for half a century. Moving it required the combined efforts of Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and Neville Rowan, while the ladies stepped back to give them room. When it finally scraped clear of the wall, a collective intake of breath marked what they found. The wainscoting behind was darker than elsewhere, protected from light and air by the furniture, but set into the paneling at about knee height was a small brass fixture, green with verdigris, capped with a hinged cover of the sort that might be found on an old-fashioned voice pipe. Miss Marple bent to examine it, though the effort clearly taxed her. Just as I suspected, she said with quiet satisfaction. A speaking tube of the kind once used to summon servants. The mouthpiece would be here, and the tube itself would run up through the wall cavity to another opening above. In room 7? Asked Slack. That would be my supposition, said Miss Marple. Shall we verify it? The climb upstairs was managed with some difficulty, Miss Marple requiring Mrs. Bantry's arm and several pauses for rest. But once in room 7, the search began in earnest. The room's wainscoting matched that below, and after some minutes of tapping and examining, Mr. Qualls discovered what they sought. Behind the bedhead, concealed by the furniture's placement, was another brass fixture, this one uncapped. Ingenious, he said, running his fingers around the opening. One could whisper into the tube downstairs and be heard quite clearly up here. Dr. Haydock placed his ear to the opening. Miss Marple, he called, would you be so kind as to speak into the lower tube? Miss Marple, who had remained in the parlor, obliged. Her voice, thin but distinct, emerged from the tube in room 7 with eerie clarity. Good gracious, said Mrs. Bantry. It's like something from a sensation. Novel. Inspector Slack was examining the mouthpiece downstairs with his magnifying glass. What he found made his expression darken. There's grease around the rim, he reported, lip rouge by the look of it. Someone's been using this recently. Miss Marple bent closer, though she did not touch the evidence. The color appears to be a rather distinctive shade, theatrical, one might say. All eyes turned to Madame Zora, whose lips were indeed painted in a dramatic crimson that matched the residue on the speaking tube. I have never used that device, she said, drawing herself up with affronted dignity. I know nothing of speaking tubes. Nevertheless, said Miss Marple gently, someone wearing lip rouge very similar to yours has spoken into it. And there is something else, Inspector. Would you examine the upper opening? Slack climbed the stairs once more and inspected the fixture in room 7. This time he found traces of fine powder clinging to the brass edge. Face powder, he announced. No mistaking it. So, said Miss Marple, settling into her chair with evident relief at being off her feet. We have lip color on the lower opening and face powder on the upper, which suggests two people, does it not? One speaking from below, one listening from above. Or, said Dr. Haydock thoughtfully, one person moving between the two positions at different times. That would require considerable agility, observed Miss Marple, and timing, though I suppose it could be managed if one were alone in the house. But Mrs. Bantry was shaking her head. The house wasn't empty, Jane. There were people everywhere on Christmas Eve. Quite so, agreed Miss Marple, which makes the use of this speaking tube particularly interesting. Someone employed it on Christmas Eve during the festivities. But for what purpose? She gazed at the tube opening with her head tilted thoughtfully. If one wished to frighten someone, she said slowly, a ghostly whisper coming from the wall would be most effective, particularly in a room already established as haunted. You think someone whispered to Pierce through this tube? Asked Slack. I think it very likely, said Miss Marple. Consider the sequence of events. The bells rang at 3 minutes before midnight. The face appeared at the window. Mr. Pierce, already, unnerved by the seance and the manifestations, retired to room 7 in a state of nervous determination. He'd been drinking, put in Dr. Haydock. Not drunk, but the punch had given him courage. Precisely, said Miss Marple. Liquid courage is often the precursor to poor judgment. Now imagine Mr. Pierce entering that room, his nerves on edge. The bolt is drawn. He is alone. And then from the wall itself comes a voice. A whisper, perhaps, warning him or instructing him. Instructing him to do what? Demanded Slack. To stand in a particular spot, said Miss Marple. Near the bed, perhaps, where the air would be most affected by the carbon monoxide accumulating from the burning charcoal. The implications of this settled. Over the parlor like a pall. That's cold-blooded, said Dr. Haydock quietly, using a man's superstitious fear to position him for murder. Indeed, said Miss Marple, though I wonder if the murderer fully appreciated how effectively carbon monoxide works. It is heavier than air initially, before the room warms and it disperses. Someone standing would be more quickly affected than someone who remains seated or lying down. Madame Zora had gone quite pale beneath her theatrical makeup. This is nonsense. I know nothing of speaking tubes or scientific matters. You know a great deal about creating atmosphere, said Mr. Qualls dryly. Your seances are most accomplished theater. That is different, protested Madame Zora. That is communing with spirits, not poisoning people with gases. Miss Marple regarded her with those sharp, bright eyes. Madame Zora, you spent considerable time in the parlor below room 7. You insisted upon sitting there. Were you alone at any point during the evening? I was in trance, said Madame Zora. One cannot be alone when communing with the other side. But physically alone, persisted Miss Marple. Before or after the seance? Madame Zora hesitated fractionally. I may have rested there briefly before the company assembled, to attune myself to the vibrations. And the settle had not yet been moved for the seance circle, said Miss Marple. So you would have been sitting quite close to the speaking tube. I noticed nothing, said Madame Zora firmly. I wonder, said Miss Marple. She rose and moved to where the thread from Neville's curtain trick still hung, tied to its nail behind the settle. Mr. Rowan, you rigged the curtain device. Did you also discover the speaking tube? Neville shook his head miserably. I never knew it was there. I was just looking for somewhere to tie off the thread. Yet someone knew, said Miss Marple. Someone who had either lived in this house long, enough to remember when such tubes were in regular use, or someone who made it their business to discover the house's secrets. She looked around the assembled faces. The question we must ask ourselves is this: who benefited from Mr. Pierce's death? And who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to arrange such an elaborate murder? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Neville Rowan was in debt to Pierce. Mrs. Rowan would lose the inn if Pierce took it over. Madame Zora knew theatrical tricks and has traces of her cosmetics on the speaking tube. And yet, said Miss Marple, we're still left with the greatest puzzle of all. How did the murderer leave room 7 with the door bolted from within? She moved to the bellboard once more, studying it with that peculiar intensity that suggested she was seeing something others had missed. "Inspector," she said presently, "I should like to conduct a small experiment. Would you be so kind as to accompany me to the pantry?" "What sort of experiment?" asked Slack wearily. "I wish to demonstrate something about bells," said Miss Marple, "and about bolts. I believe the two may be more closely connected than we have supposed." Chapter 9. A Bolt That Slides by Itself. The pantry was a cramped space made more so by the presence of Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and Neville Rowan. The bell pulls hung in their neat row, each connected to its corresponding wire that ran up through the walls to the rooms above. Miss Marple stood before them with the air of a schoolmistress, about to deliver an important lesson. "Inspector," she said, "would you be so kind as to examine the wire connected to Room 7's bell pull? I believe you will find it has been altered." Slack approached the mechanism with his magnifying glass. The wires were old, their fabric covering frayed and dusty with age. But the Room 7 wire showed a distinct anomaly. About 2 feet above the pull, a fresh splice had been made, joining 2 sections of wire with careful wrapping. "Someone's repaired it," said Slack. "Or modified it," suggested Miss Marple. "Mr. Rowan, you maintain these systems. Is this your work?" Neville's face had gone from pale to gray. Yes. The wire was damaged last month. I spliced it." "And did you notice anything unusual about the wire's path?" asked Miss Marple. "Where precisely does it run after leaving the pantry?" "Up through the wall cavity," said Neville dully. "Behind the paneling, it goes straight up to the bellboard on the first floor." "Straight up," repeated Miss Marple. "But that means it passes directly behind the wall of Room 7. She turned to Inspector Slack. "I believe if you examine the doorframe of Room 7 very carefully, particularly near the bolt mechanism, you will find something most instructive." The party relocated upstairs once more. Miss Marple remained below, claiming fatigue, but Mrs. Bantry reported back the findings with barely contained excitement. "Jane, you are absolutely right. There's a tiny brass eye screwed into the doorframe right beside where the bolt slides, and the wood has been drilled through to the wall cavity behind." In Room 7, Inspector Slack was conducting a meticulous examination of the discovery. The brass eye was small enough to be overlooked in casual inspection, positioned where the doorframe met the wall. Through a narrow hole drilled behind it, a thin wire had been threaded. Following this wire required opening a section of the paneling, which Neville did with obvious reluctance. Inside the wall cavity, the thin wire was tied securely to the bell wire that ran from the pantry below to the bellboard above. "I'll be damned," breathed Dr. Haydock. "It's connected to the bolt." Indeed, when they examined the bolt mechanism itself, they found that a short length of the thin wire had been attached to the bolt tongue through the brass eye. The arrangement was devilishly clever. When the bell wire was pulled sharply from below, it would tug on the thin wire, which would in turn draw the bolt home into its housing. Inspector Slack descended to the pantry with grim purpose. Mrs. Bantry positioned herself in the corridor outside Room 7, while Neville remained inside, watching the bolt with sick fascination. "Ready," called Slack from below. "Ready," replied Mrs. Bantry. There was a pause. Then the Room 7 bell on the board gave a sudden jingle. Simultaneously, the bolt on the door moved, sliding smoothly into place with a distinct metallic click. "It works," called Neville, his voice hollow. "The bolt's home." Slack emerged from the pantry, his face flushed with the satisfaction of proof. "That's how it was done," he declared. The murderer left Room 7, went downstairs, and pulled the bell wire from the pantry. The bolt shot home, creating a locked room. Simple as that. They gathered once more in the parlor where Miss Marple had been waiting with her eternal knitting. "Most ingenious," said Mr. Qualls, genuine admiration in his voice. "The mechanical application is quite elegant, using existing infrastructure to create an impossible situation. But it requires detailed knowledge of the house," said Dr. Haydock. "Knowledge of where the wires run, where the bolt is positioned, the skill to drill through and install the connecting mechanism." "Exactly," said Slack, and his gaze fixed on Neville. "Mr. Rowan, you admitted you spliced the bell wire. You have the run of the house. You know every inch of these walls." "I didn't do this," said Neville desperately. "Yes, I repaired the bell wire, but I never connected it to the bolt. I wouldn't know how." "Yet someone did," said Slack. "Someone with access, tools, and mechanical knowledge." Miss Marple sat down her knitting with a soft sigh. "Inspector, before you proceed, there is one detail that troubles me." "What's that?" "The timing," said Miss Marple. "You demonstrated that the bolt can be operated from the pantry. But consider when this would need to have been done." Mr. Pierce entered room 7 at 3 minutes past midnight, for the bolt to be drawn after the murderer left. Someone would need to be in the pantry with access to that specific bell pull. "So," said Slack impatiently, "we must ask ourselves who had opportunity to be in the pantry at the crucial moment." "The kitchen and service areas were active," said Mrs. Bantry. "Mrs. Rowan was overseeing the locking up. Staff were moving about." "Neville was in the cellar," said Mrs. Bantry. "Or claims he was." "Arthur heard him there," Miss Marple reminded her, "though hearing is not the same as seeing." She turned to the potman, who had been summoned again. "Arthur, you said you heard Mr. Rowan in the cellar. But where exactly were you standing?" "In the passage outside the cellar door, ma'am," said Arthur. "I called down to ask which cask he wanted next." "And you heard him reply?" "He called back that he'd manage." "Could you see down into the cellar?" "No, ma'am. It's a steep stair, and the door opens away from the light. You can't see down proper unless you go part way." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So Mr. Rowan could have been in the cellar, or he could have been elsewhere, making sounds that suggested he was in the cellar." Neville stared at her. "Why would I do that?" "To establish an alibi," said Miss Marple simply, "while actually being in the pantry operating the bell wire that secured the bolt." "But that's—" Neville stopped, his face working. "That's exactly what happened, isn't it?" "That's what you think. I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that the evidence points in a certain direction. A young man deeply in debt. A creditor threatening to take the family business. An elaborate series of mechanisms, all requiring intimate knowledge of the house, soot and feather on a scarf, salt on a roof, and opportunity, however briefly claimed, to be alone near the pantry at the critical moment." Mrs. Rowan had begun to weep silently, her composure finally breaking. Neville stood frozen, then slowly sank into a chair. His face was ashen, but there was something almost like relief in his expression. "I didn't kill him," he said, but the protest was weak. "I swear I didn't." "Then who did?" said Slack. "Who else knew about these mechanisms? Who else had motive and means?" Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, her needles clicking in the heavy silence. "That," she said quietly, "is indeed the question. And I believe the answer lies not in who could have done each individual thing, but in who had a reason to make it appear that someone else had done them all." She looked up, her eyes moving from face to face with that peculiar penetrating quality. "We have been looking at this murder as though it were a single action," she continued. "But I begin to think it is something rather different, a performance. Perhaps a series of carefully arranged clues, each pointing in a particular direction. The question is not who committed murder, but who staged one." Chapter 10. Holly and Ivy, bell wire, flue, and the one who set a ghost for Christmas. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before she spoke again. When she did, her voice was gentle but carried an unmistakable note of authority. "I should like to review the facts," she said, "if you will all bear with me. It is important that we understand not merely what happened, but why it was arranged to appear as it did." Inspector Slack looked as though he would prefer to arrest Neville immediately and sort out the details later, but Dr. Haydock gestured for silence. "Let Miss Marple speak," he said. "She's earned that much." Miss Marple inclined her head in thanks. The murder of Mr. Oswald Pierce was accomplished by carbon monoxide poisoning. Charcoal was burned in a sealed room whose chimney had been deliberately blocked. The method was clever and relatively certain, requiring only that the victim remain in the room long enough for the gas to accumulate to fatal levels. She paused to adjust her knitting. The haunting phenomena served multiple purposes. They established Room 7 as a place of supernatural activity, making it plausible that Mr. Pierce might die there of mysterious causes. They also provided cover for the installation of various mechanisms: the thread to move the curtain, the speaking tube to communicate between floors, and most crucially, the wire connecting the door bolt to the bell pull system. "All pointing to Neville," said Mrs. Rowan bitterly. "My stepson, who has made foolish choices, but is no murderer." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "And that is what troubled me from the beginning." The evidence against Mr. Rowan was remarkably complete. Too complete. Perhaps the soot on his scarf, the pillow feather, the salt on the roof, his admitted debts to Mr. Pierce, his confession to rigging the curtain trick, his knowledge of the house and its systems. "Sounds damning enough to me," said Slack. "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "which is precisely why it is suspect. In my experience, murderers attempt to conceal evidence, not arrange it so neatly that it points unmistakably in one direction." She set down her knitting and folded her hands. "Let us consider what actually happened. The chimney was blocked from the roof, requiring someone to climb up, stuff a pillow or pillow ticking into the flue, and scatter salt to obscure footprints. This was done sometime before Christmas Eve, when the weather would allow such activity. Neville admits he was on the roof," said Slack, "to check for ice dams, as any responsible person maintaining an old building would do," said Miss Marple. "But consider the soot and feather on his scarf, fresh evidence placed where it would be easily discovered. If one had genuinely climbed the roof and blocked a chimney days earlier, would such traces still be fresh and obvious?" Mr. Qualls was nodding slowly. "They would not. Soot would have been brushed away. The feather lost. These were placed deliberately." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "Someone wished us to find that evidence. Someone who had access to Neville's belongings and could plant it there." Mrs. Rowan looked up sharply. "Who?" "Let's continue," said Miss Marple. "The bell mechanism that operated the door bolt was ingenious. It required drilling through the door frame and wall, connecting a wire from the bolt to the bell wire in the cavity. This would need tools, time, and privacy. When could such work have been done without notice?" "The house has been busy," said Mrs. Bantry. "Guests coming and going for weeks." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Which is why I believe the work was done gradually over many days. A little drilling here, a bit of wire threading there, small actions that would go unnoticed in the normal chaos of running an inn at Christmas." She looked at Neville. "Mr. Rowan, you repaired the bell wire last month. Did you notice anything unusual about it then?" "No," said Neville. "It was just frayed. I spliced it and tested that the bell rang properly, that's all." "And it did ring?" "Yes." "Which means," said Miss Marple, "that the connection to the bolt was added after your repair, by someone else. Someone who understood that a repaired wire would not be examined again for some time. Inspector Slack was frowning. But who else has the knowledge and access? Miss Marple turned her bright gaze on Mrs. Rowan. Your late husband ran this inn for 30 years before his death. You have managed it for 15 years since. You know every beam, every wire, every speaking tube and bell pull in this establishment. Mrs. Rowan stiffened. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, said Miss Marple quietly, that you arrange this murder with great care, that you block the chimney yourself, being lighter and more agile than you appear, that you installed the bolt mechanism over time, working when the house was quiet, that you placed the soot and feather on Neville's scarf to implicate him, and that on Christmas Eve you executed your plan with perfect timing. That's absurd, whispered Mrs. Rowan, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Asked Miss Marple. Consider the timeline. You were in the kitchen until 20 minutes to midnight, witnessed by staff. But then you claim you went to the linen cupboard and were seen there by Mrs. Dane at 5 minutes to midnight. That leaves 15 minutes unaccounted for, 15 minutes during which you could have slipped upstairs to room 7, which Mr. Pierce had just entered. The chafing dish with burning charcoal was already in place, hidden, perhaps in the wardrobe, waiting to be positioned in the hearth once. Pierce was unconscious or distracted. You're mad, whispered Mrs. Rowan. You used the speaking tube, continued Miss Marple inexorably, to whisper warnings or instructions. Your lip rouge is on the mouthpiece below. The face powder on the upper opening is yours as well, from when you checked that the tube was properly positioned during your earlier preparations. You told Pierce to stand near the bed, perhaps claiming the widow's spirit appeared there, and then you left, secure that the charcoal would do its work. But the door, protested Slack. Someone had to operate the bolt from the pantry. Yes, said Miss Marple. And who better than the innkeeper herself, who had every reason to be in and out of the service areas. After leaving room 7, you went to the pantry. The house was busy, as you yourself had ensured by scheduling last-minute pudding work and lockups. In the confusion, you pulled the bell wire sharply. The bolt slid home. You had created your locked room. Mrs. Rowan had gone very still. Why would I kill Mr. Pierce? He was offering good money for the inn. But you would not have remained as manager, said Miss Marple. Mr. Pierce made it clear he planned modernization. You would have been pensioned off, dismissed from the establishment that has been your life's work. Worse, Neville would have inherited nothing, lost everything to Pierce's manipulations. You acted to protect your stepson and your home. You can't prove any of this, said Mrs. Rowan. Can't I? Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. This is a brass eye screw of the type used to fix the wire to the door bolt. I found its twin in your workroom this morning. The metal is identical. The threading matches exactly, Dr. Haydock leaned forward. And the lip rouge on the speaking tube matches Mrs. Rowan's shade, not Madame Zora's. I compared them when no one was watching. Mrs. Rowan's facade crumbled. For a long moment she sat with her head bowed, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat with exhaustion. He would have taken everything. 30 years of my husband's work. 15 years of mine and Neville, foolish boy, would have been ruined. I couldn't allow it. So you made it appear that Neville had done it, said Miss Marple sadly. Your own stepson. He would have been acquitted, said Mrs. Rowan. The evidence was circumstantial. I made certain it was, but Pierce would be dead, the debts void, and the inn saved. Inspector Slack rose, his face grim. Mrs. Ellsworth Rowan, I am arresting you for the murder of Oswald Pierce. As Mrs. Rowan was led away, Neville stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and grief. Miss Marple approached him gently. She loved this house too much, she said quietly, and perhaps she loved you as well, in her way. But murder is never justified, no matter the motive. Later, as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry prepared to return to Gossington Hall, where the burst pipes had finally been repaired, Dolly turned to her friend. "Jane, how did you know it was Mrs. Rowan?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The pudding work. She claimed to be plating puddings until 20 minutes to midnight. Yet the maid saw her in the kitchen at 5 to 12. Why return to the kitchen unless she needed an alibi for that specific time? And the speaking tube grease matched her cosmetics, not Madame Zora's garish theatrical paint." "Small things, my dear, they always are." Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway. "We found the pillow in the ash pit. She'd burned most of it, but enough remains to prove it came from the inn's linen cupboard." He nodded grudgingly to Miss Marple. "You were right about all of it." "I have had some experience," said Miss Marple mildly, "with the darker aspects of human nature." As their motor car drove away from the Holly and Ivy Inn, Mrs. Bantry looked back at the snow-covered building. "Rather spoils one's taste for Christmas mysteries," she said. "On the contrary," said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting once more. "It confirms that wickedness is never quite as clever as it believes itself to be, and that is rather reassuring, don't you think?" The snow continued to fall softly over St. Mary Mead as they drove home through the winter twilight, leaving the haunted inn and its tragic secrets behind.